Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really pulling back the curtain on a group that's, well, significantly shaped the Republican Party in the House Freedom Caucus.
Yeah, they've been right in the thick of it, haven't they? Especially with everything happening in the new 119th Congress and, President Trump's agenda starting to roll out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to understand them, we've got quite a range of sources here.
We do. We're looking at their Wikipedia page for the basics, recent news from places like the AP, BBC, The Independent.
We even dipped into a Reddit political discussion for some, let's say, varied perspectives.
Right, plus a working paper from Northwestern University to add some academic context. So a real mix.
Our mission here is basically to sift through all this. We want to understand who the Freedom Caucus is, where they came from, how they operate.
Their impact, which is often pretty contentious, especially with party leadership.
Exactly. And how they played into big moments, like getting that one big, beautiful bill act passed recently.
Well.
We'll pull out the key events and the different takes from our sources.
And hopefully by the end, you'll have a much better handle on this really key faction and the whole political landscape they're navigating and, well, shaping.
Okay, let's dive in then. So first things first, what exactly is the House Freedom Caucus?
Okay, so fundamentally, it's a caucus, a group of Republicans in the House of Representatives.
But they're not just any group of Republicans.
No, not at all. The sources are pretty consistent on this. They're generally seen as the most conservative bloc in the House, often described as the furthest right. They tend to operate a bit outside the main party structure.
And they haven't been around forever, right?
Yeah.
When did they actually form?
Relatively recently, actually, January 2015. It seems it grew out of conservatives, many linked to the Tea Party movement, wanting a more defined group.
Right.
The idea apparently really came together during a Republican retreat that month.
So it was a conscious decision, not just people who happened to agree finding each other.
Yeah, it seems very intentional. One of the founders, Mick Mulvaney, is quoted saying something like, "It was the first time we got together and decided we were a group and not just a bunch of pissed off guys."
Huh. That paints a picture.
Yeah.
So what was their main goal in forming this group?
Well, the stated aim was pretty clear. Push the House Republican leadership further to the right. They felt existing conservative groups weren't maybe effective enough.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Jordan, their first chairman, described wanting something smaller, more cohesive, more agile, and more active.
Interesting. Who were the original people involved in setting it up?
The sources list 9 representatives as the founding board: Scott Garrett, Jim Jordan, John Fleming, Matt Salmon, Justin Amash, Raul Labrador, Mick Mulvaney, Ron DeSantis, and Mark Meadows.
Wow, that's quite a list. A lot of names that have stayed very relevant.
Definitely.
So how did this group change over time, particularly once Donald Trump entered the scene?
Ah, yes, that seems to be a key point. Sources suggest a shift after Trump's election. The caucus reportedly became more populist and nationalist, maybe less strictly tied to specific policy principles than before.
So adapting to the Trump era.
It looks like it. They started with a very clear ideological focus, but seemed to become maybe a bit more flexible, sometimes incorporating members with more libertarian views, for instance.
And who's leading the caucus now?
The current chairman is Andy Harris. And it's worth noting, the sources mention they've kind of branched out.
How so?
Well, there's the House Freedom Fund, PAC-T, that helps elect candidates they support, and also the State Freedom Caucus Network, which is basically exporting their model to state legislatures.
Trying to build influence beyond just the House floor.
Okay.
How big are they compared to other Republican groups in the House, like the Republican Study Committee?
Good question. In terms of sheer numbers, they're smaller. The Freedom Caucus is listed around 34 members. Compare that to the Republican Study Committee that's massive, like 158 members, or the Main Street Caucus, around 79. The Liberty Caucus is smaller, maybe 10.
So numerically, they're not the biggest force.
Right. But what's fascinating, and what the sources emphasize, is their influence. Because they tend to vote as a bloc and they're willing to really dig in their heels, they often have power that seems disproportionate to their actual numbers.
And that power, that willingness to dig in, really comes through when you look at their history with Republican leadership. They've clashed quite a bit, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. That's a recurring theme. The sources point directly to their role in pressuring Speaker John Boehner, which was a major factor in his resignation back in 2015.
They weren't afraid to take on their own speaker.
Not at all. Then came Paul Ryan.
How did that play out? Was it the same dynamic?
A bit different, actually. There was some initial friction, sure, but eventually a supermajority of the caucus did end up backing Ryan for Speaker later that year. So it shows they could negotiate even if they were seen as hardliners.
Okay, fast forward to the Trump administration. That healthcare fight in 2017 seems like a key moment.
It really does. It's almost a textbook example of their approach. The GOP, leadership, the White House, they were all pushing hard to repeal and replace Obamacare with the American Health Care Act.
Right.
But the Freedom Caucus members, they stood firm. They argued it didn't go far enough, that it wasn't a full repeal. Their opposition was critical in sinking that bill.
Which caused problems with Trump at the time, didn't it?
Big time. There was definite friction there. But interestingly, over time, that relationship seemed to evolve.
How so?
Well, some sources describe the caucus becoming much more aligned with Trump, almost like a Trump loyalty club. They strongly opposed his second impeachment. And sources also highlight their role in the efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. It's noted, too, that the members who objected to the results generally won re-election in 2022.
So moving closer to the present, 2023, 2024, the internal conflicts didn't exactly disappear.
Far from it. Sometimes the conflicts were even within the conservative movement itself. You had that very public spat between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert on the House floor.
I remember that.
And Greene had sometimes sided with Speaker McCarthy, breaking from the caucus line. The result, the caucus actually voted, in secret, to expel her in June 2023.
Wow. That shows some serious internal discipline, or maybe willingness to enforce conformity.
Yeah. And then you had the debt ceiling fight in 2023, another major flashpoint.
Right. They weren't happy with the deal McCarthy struck with Biden.
Not at all. Many conservative Republicans, including Freedom Caucus members, strongly opposed it. They were unhappy about spending levels, the debt ceiling increase.
And that opposition continued, didn't it?
It did. One source mentions a specific vote late in December 2024, right before the new Congress, where 38 conservatives voted against extending spending deadlines, even after Trump had apparently influenced some changes to the deal. Shows that resistance to spending remains strong.
All this tension building up, and then the explosion. Kevin McCarthy ousted as Speaker.
A truly historic moment. And Bob Good, who was the Freedom Caucus chair then, was one of the 8 Republicans who voted McCarthy out. That had major repercussions.
For him personally and for the caucus.
Both. Good faced a lot of backlash within the party. And then, crucially, he had endorsed Ron DeSantis for president, not Trump.
Ooh, that wouldn't sit well.
No. Trump endorsed Good's primary challenger, John McGuire, who ended up winning. And this whole fight fractured the caucus itself. Warren Davidson was reportedly expelled. Troy Niels resigned in protest.
And Good himself stepped down as chair after losing the primary recount.
Right. In September 2024, it really underscores Trump's influence, but also the deep, deep factionalism that can exist within the caucus.
Which leads us right into the start of this current Congress, January 2025, and another speaker fight.
What a start to the session that was. Mike Johnson, even with Trump's endorsement, was facing real opposition from some conservatives.
And the margins were razor thin.
Exactly. He needed 218 votes, and for a while there on the floor, it really looked like he might fall short.
You could see the tension, the huddles happening right there.
Absolutely. He seemed short. There was this intense huddle with allies and some of the holdouts.
But then, some minds were changed.
They were. Reps Keith Self and Ralph Norman flipped their votes to support Johnson. The reporting suggests they spoke with both Johnson and President-elect Trump. And Trump apparently pushed the message of unity, needing to get the agenda moving. In the end, only Thomas Massie held out among Republicans.
So Johnson got there just barely on the first ballot.
He did. 218 to 215. Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader, actually introduced him, and then Johnson gave his acceptance speech.
What was the message in that speech? What did he lay out?
He hit on familiar themes, limited government, individual freedom, but he was very clear that with unified Republican control, House, Senate, White House, they had a mandate for an America First agenda.
Did he list specifics?
Oh, yes. Securing the border, mass deportations, finishing the wall, fighting inflation, extending the Trump tax cuts, shrinking the federal government, ending EV mandates. He also explicitly said unified government meant a different process was coming for legislation.
And Trump's reaction? Pleased.
Very pleased, according to the sources. He congratulated Johnson on Truth Social, called it an unprecedented vote of confidence, and dubbed him a great speaker.
Okay, so speaker elected. What about the House rules? That was a big point of contention last Congress.
A huge focus right at the start. They passed the rules package, 215-209. And the headline change was definitely aimed at preventing a repeat of the McCarthy ouster.
Raising the threshold for the motion to vacate.
Exactly. Instead of just one member being able to force that vote, now it takes 9 Republican members, a significant increase.
What other changes were in that package? Anything notable?
Yeah, a few things the sources mentioned. Restricting votes to suspend the rules too early in the week, Mon-Wed, getting rid of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, putting back some language they called family-centric, authorizing subpoenas related to Biden family investigations, and renaming a couple of committees and offices. Oversight became Oversight and Government Reform. Congressional ethics became congressional conduct.
And was security noticeably tighter around the Capitol for the opening?
Yes, sources noted the return of fencing and increased coordination between Capitol Police, Secret Service, and other agencies. DHS even designated the upcoming January 6th electoral vote count as a national special security event.
Okay, so leadership set, rules adopted. Now, on to the legislative agenda. What were the immediate priorities for this new unified Republican government?
Immigration and taxes were right at the top, according to our sources, and the Plan A was to use budget reconciliation.
The key procedural tool to get around the Senate filibuster.
Precisely. It lets certain budget-related bills pass the Senate with just 51 votes, not 60.
But even on how to use reconciliation, there wasn't complete agreement.
No, interesting internal debate there. The sources suggest Senate GOP leaders and the Freedom Caucus lean towards 2 separate reconciliation bills, maybe one for border and energy, another for taxes.
Okay.
But President-elect Trump and the House leadership apparently pushed for one single massive bill.
And that became the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
That's the one, Trump's name for it, officially, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
And this bill just recently passed the House, right? Though the dates seem a bit mixed in our sources.
Yeah, one source says HCon Res 14 passed Feb 25th, 217-215, with Massey as the only GOP no. Another, the BBC, reported passage of a big tax breaks package on May 22nd, 215-214.
So slight discrepancies on the exact date or resolution number, but the core point is it passed, and by an incredibly narrow margin.
Extremely narrow. And it happened.
What's actually in this giant bill? It's over 1,000 pages, apparently.
It is. The descriptions say it extends the 2017 tax cuts, puts money towards defense and mass deportations, gets rid of taxes on tips, and makes cuts to government health care programs.
And the process itself drew some criticism.
It did. Multiple reports pointed out, like you said, over 1,000 pages released just hours before the vote, which, raises questions about how well lawmakers understood what they were voting on. Could be hidden details in there.
And the cost. The impact on the debt.
That's a huge point of contention. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimated it would add about $2.3 trillion to the national debt over 10 years.
Wow.
Now, the Trump White House argues that tax cuts will boost the economy and tariffs will bring in revenue to offset that.
But most experts disagree.
Yeah, the sources suggest most experts think it will add to the debt. And here's where it gets tricky for the Freedom Caucus. Again, they traditionally push for fiscal conservatism and reportedly wanted more spending cuts in this bill than they got. Yet it passed.
So it squeaked through the House. Where does it go now?
Straight to the Senate. The Senate can pass it as is, or they can change it.
And there's that potential trigger for Medicare cuts.
Right. That's a crucial detail mentioned. If the CBO confirms the debt increase, it could apparently trigger automatic cuts to Medicare, maybe around $500 billion because of an old 2011 law. Meanwhile, Trump's urging the Senate to hurry up and get it to his desk.
But even with this big legislative win, the sources suggest the internal GOP fighting isn't over.
Not by a long shot. We found a source from March talking about the Freedom Caucus actually trying to block a discharge petition started by one of its own members. The description was, they want to play hardball.
Wow, fighting within the ranks.
Yeah. And then another source from April mentioned the caucus losing yet another member due to these internal fights, and the House even voting to defy Speaker Johnson on something, calling it a painful blow.
So the dysfunction continues despite the unified government.
It certainly seems that way. These aren't just minor disagreements. They sound like serious procedural fights revealing ongoing deep divisions.
Which makes those different perspectives on Speaker Johnson himself, especially from that Reddit thread, really fascinating. They capture the conflicting views.
Absolutely. You see this whole spectrum. Some commenters there seem to view him as maybe less extreme than they first feared, or perhaps just constrained by the tiny majority.
Suggesting he has to compromise. Or maybe wants to govern.
Kind of.
Yeah.
that he recognizes the reality of the situation, but then you have the complete opposite take right alongside it.
Oh, yes.
That he's fully driven by ideology, people calling him a religious zealot, suggesting he answers to God before the Constitution, maybe making deals with Trump trading votes for zealotry, as one comment put it.
And some of the comments got pretty personal and critical.
Very. Accusations like pathological liar, election denier, living in a fantasy world. Some brought up things like the porn accountability software with his son or a purity ball with his daughter.
Using those as evidence of extreme social views.
Yeah, interpreting his views as wanting, quote, barefoot and pregnant youth. Really strong language reflecting deep opposition.
But it wasn't all negative in that thread, was it?
No, there were other voices too. Some commenters saw him as perhaps the best we can hope for among the current Republicans. Some seemed impressed by how he's managed the infighting so far, suggesting he sometimes puts country over politics.
And people noted his background, too.
Right. Pointing out he came from the Republican Study Committee, not originally the Freedom Caucus, and mentioning his clear evangelical bent.
So pulling all those Reddit comments and other source insights together, you really see the tightrope Johnson is walking.
Exactly. It's this fundamental tension. His own conservative principles and the stated party agenda versus the sheer pragmatism needed to lead with almost no margin for error. Can he push his agenda pure and simple, or is compromise inevitable?
And that tension really defines the challenge for the entire House GOP right now, doesn't it? They won the speakership. They changed the rules to try and bring stability.
But the sources make it crystal clear. The internal divisions, the turmoil, especially with that hardline conservative wing, it's still very much alive.
That tiny majority means Johnson needs practically everyone on board for every single vote, unless he wants to rely on Democrats.
Which seems unlikely for most major agenda items. And as these recent events show, conflict within the party is still bubbling up, even after the speaker fight, even after passing the big bill.
So it leaves this huge question mark, doesn't it? Even with control of the White House and both chambers of Congress, can they actually deliver on that big agenda they talked about? The sources show one major bill passed, yes, but also signs of ongoing significant dysfunction.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through these sources tracking the Freedom Caucus from its origins, through its evolution, its conflicts, and its undeniable impact on recent events.
You've really seen how this group's strategy, combined with that incredibly narrow House majority, creates a political environment that's, well, challenging and unpredictable, even under unified party control.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with, really stemming from all these internal conflicts we've discussed. Can a House majority this narrow, constantly dealing with the kind of intense internal factionalism described in our sources within the GOP and even within the Freedom Caucus itself, realistically enact a truly sweeping, transformative agenda?
Or is the more likely path continued gridlock? Or maybe needing to build unexpected, temporary coalitions to get anything done? What does this constant tension, this friction that the sources reveal, actually mean for the basic ability to govern? Something for you to think about as these political dynamics keep playing out.